Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
We're discussing the 2019 remake of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. And then we'll end with a critique of One Lucky Author's Query.
Here come the spoilers. Here's the summary. This movie is about the March family, 4 sisters, their parents, their aunt, and the dramas of their lives as they move from being teenagers to being adults. In 1868, Jo March is a teacher in New York City, but she also publishes stories in newspapers. After receiving a letter that her younger sister Beth's illness has worsened, Jo returns home. The movie jumps to 7 years earlier. Jo and her 3 sisters live with their mother, Marmee, in Concord, Massachusetts. Jo meets Laurie, a young man who lives nearby, and he becomes close friends with all of the girls, but especially Jo. From there, the film moves between the later timeline, showing how each sister has chosen to live her life her way, and the years in between. We see the jealous Amy burn the manuscript of Jo's novel, each of the girls as they fall in love or not, Jo pursuing her career as an author, Meg marrying and starting a family, Amy traveling to Europe with their aunt and meeting Laurie, and Beth staying home with Marmee and taking care of a nearby family whose children are sick. The timelines converge when Beth's illness takes a turn and Meg and Jo return home. Beth dies, reuniting the rest of the characters. Amy and Laurie have married. Jo writes a novel based on the lives of her and her sisters and publishes it. Here, the movie ends differently than the book and previous versions of the movie, with Jo remaining unmarried and opening a school where she and her sisters teach. So, Jenny, what did you think about the movie?
For the most part, I really enjoyed it. I've never read the book somehow, and this is the first time I've seen an adaptation of it. It's weird because I love like Jane Austen and the Brontes, but somehow this book in particular slipped past me growing up. So I liked this adaptation, but I think I may have suffered a little bit from unrealistic expectations after years of people yelling at me that I need to read and watch this movie.
That's fair.
So, but looking at the movie on its own merit, it has a lot of the things I love. It has that historical setting, strong women who go after what they want, more to life than just getting married. The family relationships are absolutely amazing, which is always a big draw for me.
Same.
They're so real in terms of both being so close and also sometimes like really hating each other. So what did you think?
I'm going to be honest here. I'm not sure if I ever read the book. I really can't remember. It's one of those where I know the story so well, and I've seen a bunch of adaptations, and I think I read it when I was younger, but I honestly just really don't know. It really could go either way. It's probably like 50-50 chance that I read it. So we're probably really bad editors. I think we've made a mistake. Should we pick a different movie? Oh well. No turning back. Okay. Either way, I loved this adaptation way more than I've liked any of the other previous ones I've seen. I think the attention to detail in this one and like the way they played with sound. There's this moment in the very beginning where Jo is running down the street and time slows down a little bit and it focuses on her heartbeat. And there's just some really interesting, cool moments like that were just so impeccable. And like you were saying, the acting was amazing. The script was beyond good. The way they all talked to each other and their dialogue was perfect. It felt like a family. You knew that they knew each other so intimately and like loved each other and hated each other and all the normal fun family goodness.
Right.
And I really do love this story. There's so much strength and honesty in it that I think can be hard to find in a lot of other books. And we do need to talk about the ending of this adaptation, which I was pretty excited about. So in the book, Jo marries Professor Bayer. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think so.
Remember. At the end. And this was actually Louisa May Alcott bowing to the expectations at the time that female characters needed to be married off for them to have a satisfying ending. And in this adaptation, we see Jo kind of converge with the author, Louisa May Alcott, which makes sense because it's semi-autobiographical. And in the movie, Jo writes the original ending for the book. But we get to see that in reality, she ends up pursuing her literary career. And her big moment at the end, the thing that feels satisfying, is she gets to hold her book in her hands and be like, I've done it. I've published my book. Instead of focusing on, oh, now she has a happy husband. And I just love this ending so much more. I know when I was a kid, I used to be mad that Jo didn't end up with Laurie. And then as I grew up, I kind of realized, oh, no, it makes sense that they don't. But I still didn't like her ending up with the professor. And I think this is what I always felt was missing from it. But anyway, what did you think the movie did well that authors should take note of?
Well, I think what really stood out to me in this movie is that it's told in dual timelines. It's not how the book is written, from what I understand. But the movie is told with dual timelines, which I think was really interesting. I've read and edited a lot of dual timeline stories over the years, and they can be really hard to pull off. And I think that's because, in a nutshell, the problem with dual timeline stories is that you're essentially telling two stories, but they have to be interconnected, and that creates these two big problems. One, everything that can go wrong with one story can also go wrong here, but double. And then two, creating those connections is really hard just by itself between the two stories. So I know several authors who wrote dual timeline stories as their first novels, and oh my gosh, did they set themselves up for a challenge, because it really does take a strong understanding of storytelling and all of those elements that we talk about all the time with plot and pacing and characterization and character arc and all of that stuff.
All that structure.
Right, all of that structural stuff. So I think the problem I see most often, though, in dual timeline manuscripts is that both of the stories have to be equally engaging. And really often it feels like the author was more interested in one of the timelines than the other. And that comes through in the story as one timeline being boring or even acting like a framing device for the other timeline. And in this movie, I never had that feeling. And you kind of get the same thing in well-written dual timeline novels where both stories are equally interesting. I never felt like, ooh, can we hurry up and get back to that other timeline because that's the interesting one. I felt fully immersed and completely engaged in what was happening in each.
I completely agree. I hate when it's like, oh, here's where all the exciting stuff is happening. Oh no, let's go back to this other place where I guess everyone's sitting around a table chatting or whatever. Right. I don't know what example I'm referencing.
Okay, see, I always think of like that framing device as being like the Princess Bride. Because in the Princess Bride, it's used as a framing device. You know, it's not supposed to be dual timelines or dual POV. It's used as a framing device, and in that way, it's well executed in its own way. But if those were supposed to be two separate timelines stories, or two separate stories, they just wouldn't be equally engaging. And I don't think they are equally engaging. So, it all comes down to the intent and the vision of the author. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. You did it at all. I completely agree. You got to balance both storylines. And And I think this movie does it really well. You have to, but you also have to remember to balance it in terms of word count too.
Right.
And I think from what it felt like, at least, this movie gave screen time equally to kind of both sides of the story. And it doesn't need to be exactly 50-50. Of course, that's impossible to pull off because sometimes you need more word count elsewhere. But it needs to be really organized to keep those switches from being jarring. It's like when you have a dual point of view novel, you want to balance both so we feel like we spend an equal amount of time with each story or each character. But at the same time, you need to be careful that you're not adding in these like filler scenes that are just filling up that word count or filling up that space, because you'll lose all of your pacing, you'll lose interest, you won't keep that engagement up that you were just talking about.
Right.
And I think one way this movie does it so well is by having those dual timelines mirror each other. It felt like we were learning the context with each scene as we flashed back into the past. We were seeing how their memories and their history shaped each moment that they were living. And we see that life kind of has a way of repeating itself and coming back around, and everything is kind of circular. It's all continually tied together in this very seamless, natural way. That mirroring and tying of plots makes them really interwoven, so it feels fluid to transition from one to the other.
Right.
And we can see both stories building together on the same plot. It doesn't feel like a jarring transition because they are so interwoven that they build one after the other onto each other. And I think that is imperative in dual timeline stories. We need to see them build together. They can't be completely separate stories that aren't linked.
Right.
Even if the link is separated by centuries or miles, we need to see that they have that common thread and that plot that they're building together.
Right. Right.
You know?
Yeah. So you mentioned transitions between the timelines. And them being jarring. And in this movie, I actually struggled with that a little bit because they were so not jarring that it wasn't always immediately clear when we were transitioning between scenes in the same timeline or when we jumped to the other timeline. And in movies, they usually use some kind of visual cue for this. But in this one, the characters and sets often look more or less the same in both timelines. In a manuscript, it's actually a little easier because there are several different devices you can use. You can put the date at the beginning of each scene. You can keep the timelines together by chapter. So like only switch timelines when you switch chapters. You can also use that asterisk to separate them. But be really careful how often you switch like that because that can be jarring. And having several time jumps in one chapter can also be really confusing for readers. It's the same thing with points of view. So like when you have, several points of view in a story like, say, Game of Thrones, it can be very jarring to have several point of view shifts within one chapter. So you want to sometimes kind of try to keep those grouped together as much as possible. The other thing that you can do is... you can, sorry, I totally just lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
The other part that's really important, I want to go back to what you said about the scenes mirroring each other. Okay, so you kind of touched on, we start the movie in the more recent timeline, and then the other timeline acts as flashbacks. We can see in the more recent timeline, kind of what's happening that pushes the main plot forward. But then the other timeline, those points of view, those flashbacks, kind of show us what was happening. Like you said, it gives us that context. And we're always going from like pushing the story forward to context that's pushing that story forward, and it's filling in all of that backstory for us. So the very first flashback shows how Joe met Lori, and then it proceeds through a few scenes showing how he became friends with all of the sisters. It relates because both Amy and Joe's storylines are tied to Lori, and because then it sets up what Joe thinks of as home as she's rushing home due to Beth's illness. So there's both this internal and external tie between the flashback and the more recent plot lines. It's also showing the inciting incident of both timelines then, because Joe meeting Lori is really kind of the inciting incident of that timeline, and Joe going home because of Beth's illness is kind of the inciting incident in the more recent timeline.
Right. And I think that's also so important because often I tend to cut flashbacks from a lot of manuscripts.
Me too.
Flashbacks are so hard to pull off because they end up being either an info dump or just pure context. They're usually not moving the story forward. But in these flashbacks, partly because it is a separate timeline that we're getting fully fleshed out, is that we're still getting those important moments like the inciting incident that you're talking about. Stuff is still happening in the past that isn't purely there to lend context to the present.
Right.
It is its own story in its own right because they're still hitting on those key moments that you're talking about. And I think it's really important to make sure that each timeline is plotted out correctly to hit your inciting incident, the end of Act 1, your bend point, your turning point, things like that. You want to make sure we're hitting all of those things so that each story feels as important as the other. And you want to keep that pacing up, basically, and that interest. And I think this movie does that really, really well. And it can be difficult to have two major plot points. They're going to have to both happen at basically the exact same time. But you still need to keep it there. You still need to have it happening. And I think it really helps, like we were saying, the more interwoven your plots are, the more mirrored that they tend to be. Having those two big moments, even if they're disparate moments, at the same time is going to feel more natural because they will have that connection and that similar thread. So make sure that your stories are really building together. As I've mentioned a lot, I'm all about having those timelines interwoven. And that doesn't mean actually like don't have us hopping back and forth within a scene.
We just need to see those connections.
Yeah, we need those connections and that theme and that thread.
Right.
We need to see how they build on each other while keeping their individual pacing up. Because I actually have to kind of disagree. I really liked the transitions in this movie. I kind of had fun figuring out, based on like context clues, whether this was the past or the present, whose hair was short, whose wasn't.
Sure.
Things like that. But with books in particular, please do not do that. Do not leave us wondering for many, many pages where we are in time. Because you don't, in a book, you're so in a person's head that it's kind of hard to find your place a little bit more.
Right.
When it's a very subtle jump in time. You want to make sure you keep us grounded. You don't have those visual cues. You have to like really place us there, keep us there, show us where we are.
Right.
Which is why I like it to happen at chapter breaks. And if you do have to do it mid-chapter, please only do it once. That's kind of my rule. You can have one POV or time shift per chapter. Otherwise, I'm like, where am I? Whose head am I in? What's happening? Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. That can be really confusing. And confusing and jarring are two words that you don't want to see in reviews about your book. So, so something you said just now, talking about having the two stories, that the structure needs to be essentially the same. So when I will edit a and I mean, I see when I was thinking about this being dual timeline, I wasn't thinking about how it really applies to dual POV too, but it really does.
It really does.
And so a lot of times when I'll edit them, I will give the client the advice to separate the stories, like kind of pull all of one story into one document and all of the other story into the other document and read through them to make sure they make sense, they hit all the same plot points at the right times. Also help you see it in terms of word count, and how far off you might be with those. Again, it doesn't have to be 50-50, but you want it to be close enough that you are really getting the connection with both of them instead of, again, one feeling like a framing device for the other one.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a noticeable difference.
Right. So I think that pulling them apart and really examining them structurally for all of those different plot points, like you said, I think that can be a really valuable tool when you are working with multiple points of view, multiple timelines, whatever like that, so that you can make sure everything is hitting those points where they need to be, and then they'll hit those points together, so that your reader doesn't. The problem with it not doing that is it can be really hard to keep up a consistent sort of tension and pacing if your stories are hitting those important points in separate sections of the book. Then you've got kind of your tension and pacing is kind of all over the place, and it makes it hard for your reader to stay emotionally engaged in a story when those things are kind of all over the place, all up and down.
Yeah. I mean, and also consider that most readers aren't reading it all in one sitting. I think that's part of why books need to keep things like super clear and concise, is that you don't want them spending an hour trying to remember what happened previously and where we are and why we're there.
Right.
It should feel natural and it should flow because you're hitting those points. It's that kind of structural security in a way. But yeah, I completely agree. And I think when you were talking about like pulling those pieces apart separately, I think for those visual learners, it's very much like a scene in this movie where Jo is writing her story and she lays it all across the attic floor and each page is separate and she's moving things around and playing with them. And I think it could be a really good exercise for those visual people to fully separate out those stories, and even if it is dual point of view versus dual timeline, and then literally connect those pages to see where the threads connect through so that you're making sure it is all threaded together while still balancing the separate structure and the like individuality of each section, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think also using like note cards or sticky notes and just sort of having the details of scenes on there. You can graph it, kind of create like a chart for it. Like there's all kinds of tools that writers have come up with to help them kind of see their story more visually. So you don't have to read that same 80 to 120,000 words over and over and over again.
Yeah, it gets hard to see the forest for the trees.
Yes, you definitely start to lose perspective on it. The more you read it, the more perspective you lose, I think.
Yes, agreed.
So there's one thing we haven't talked about yet that's really important. We have to make sure we talk about this every podcast. So who is the really cool side female character that we liked a lot and wanted to see more of?
Are we discounting all of the sisters?
I don't think so. I feel like in this adaptation, at least,
it was very focused on Jo.
It was very focused on Jo and then on Amy and then sort of everybody else.
Yeah. So I'm going to maybe go out in left field. I think I wanted to see more of their aunt.
Yeah. See, I kind of thought that's how I was going to feel at the beginning. But then she started making kind of like super racist and classist statements.
She was very classist.
She was, but she also makes a comment about her dad it was more important for her dad, for Joe's dad, to teach
Oh, yeah.
Friedman's kids to read than it was for him to provide for his own family. And I was like, rude.
Yeah. That's fair.
So I don't know. She crossed a line for me. She went from like
I could
too
see that.
far. She sort of started out as that like Maggie Smith and Downton Abbey kind of character, but she just kind of
And then she
took it
went
a
too
little
far.
too far for me. Yeah.
That's fair.
So I think mine was Marmee.
Marmee was great.
I kind of want to see the prequel about her. There's a scene where Marmee is what they call their mother. And there's a scene between Marmee and Joe where Marmee is talking about that she used to be, that she has a lot of anger that she's learned over the course of her life to not let it control her, but that she still feels a lot of anger all the time.
She's angry every day, she says.
Yeah. She's basically the Incredible Hulk.
Yep.
Which I can
It's definitely
identify
relatable.
with. Yeah,
Yep,
exactly.
there we go.
Especially lately. I thought that was it was a facet that I was like, ooh, I want to know more about that. Like, I want to see
fair.
like what young Marmee was like. I want to see that love story with her getting together with their dad.
Yes.
I thought
Especially
that
because
was
they still seem to love each other.
Yes, absolutely, and they
crazy
seem
in
like
these
such a
books.
great. They seem like such a great couple.
So I think maybe why I picked the aunt is because it's actually Amy that
Yeah.
I want to see more of. Because we do see a lot of her, but it's always in context of Joe
Yeah,
and her relation to Joe.
it's true.
And I remember as a kid really hating Amy and being like, she is such a brat. Makes no sense. She's just evil.
Yeah.
Because it was a simpler time. But now I'm like, oh no, maybe Amy she was an impetuous child. She burned her manuscript, which is unforgivable
Yes.
just because she wanted to hurt her. But
And there were no like cloud backups.
I know. What do we do without our cloud? But actually, I don't know. I kind of related to her more. Maybe it's because I'm a younger sibling, but like that being left out and always in her shadow and trying to kind of be her own person
Yeah.
is interesting, especially that she ends up with Lori, which I hated as a kid.
They really seem much better suited for each other than
They
Joe
do.
and Lori do, though.
But like that's got to be a complex relationship. Can you imagine that?
I really can't. No.
That insecure, I would be very insecure.
Yeah.
And she does take that classism from her aunt of like, oh no, you need to marry well because you need to provide for this family.
Yeah.
Like there's nobody else. Everyone else has given up on actually providing.
Yeah.
And Amy's like, okay, well, here's what I got to do.
Yeah.
Even though I love my art. Like, I think that's an interesting.
There's so much feminist subtext
story.
in this story. There really is. There's so much feminist subtext in this story in terms of women making their own decisions, and that sometimes that means being a wife, being a mother. Sometimes that means, striking out on your own and being the starving artist. And it can mean everything kind of in between. So I think all of that is really interesting as well. Probably maybe the topic of another podcast.
So before we move on, though, here's the other important question. Which March sister are you? Or which one do you think I am?
Okay,
Because maybe
who
we
are
can't
you?
judge ourselves.
I feel like I'm like half Joe and half Meg.
That's what I was going to say you were.
I do. Honestly, okay, so part of why I like Marmee so much is when my own mom died and I started seeing more of like how I'm turning into her. I have a lot of these like really complex feelings around what was she like when she was really young, before I was born, before I could have known her, and seeing ways that were similar now, but it's different than the way I think of myself. And that particular thing about always being angry, really, because I had a terrible temper when I was young. And I've learned how to, like, not just, I think it's not just for me that I don't let it control me, but I've learned how to express it in healthier ways and, yada, yada, yada.
Except when you're angry with me, but that's
Oh,
fine.
I still express it in healthy ways. What are you talking about, Carly? So yeah, I'm trying to think which one of them. I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like everybody I know identifies with Joe. Everybody I know
Well,
identifies with
yes.
her on some level. Um,
I
in
mean,
part
she's
because I
the
know, and she's a
feminist,
bookworm, you know, so like
and she's the feminist
most of the
bookworm that
people
we
I
all
know are
are.
bookworms. So that's definitely part of it. I feel like you're definitely not Beth.
Rude, but okay.
You're a very generous person, but you're not Beth.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you might be like half
I think
Joe and half
Joe,
Amy.
F. Amy.
I think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, we share the Joe.
Yeah.
You're definitely more of the mothering, Meg, supportive thing.
Yeah.
I'm definitely more of the impetulant little sister,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. You're
At least
definitely
in our
like a little
dynamic.
sister.
Yeah, we get that. We get how you feel about me. It's fine.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting too because I feel like they each, again, I'm not going to get like too deep into the symbolism. Each of them kind of represents different facets of a personality,
Yes.
you know. And they did some really interesting things in the movie, kind of showing each of their personalities, and like I noticed in the opening scenes and then the movie that Joe always has ink stains on her fingers, and their hair looks different, and they just do some really great visual things with representing their personalities as well, which I think is what you were saying in the beginning about like having all these little details that really
Yeah.
help.
The attention to detail is amazing.
Yeah, that really help just kind of create that whole picture of this story. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I feel like we could go on and on about that.
Well, and I
Probably.
do think they each represent kind of a different form of feminism a little bit too, which I think was really cool and interesting to see those different aspects and that it doesn't have to mean one thing. It's all about the empowerment of who you want to be, which I
Right.
thought was really cool
I think so too.
and well done. All right. Anyway, so this month we have a query from a YA high fantasy. In this fantasy, we see a hero and heroine play with the trope of being the chosen one as they combat expectations. Jenny, what did you think of this query?
Overall, I think this query is already really strong.
I agree.
I think it's important, though, in all queries, one of the hardest things to do is to decide what details need to go in and what need to stay out. And I think this stems from the author has all of these details in their head, and to them, it's their world is almost as real as the real world. Maybe sometimes even more so. So, as the author, it's really important to consider carefully what details you actually need in the query, and especially when the story takes place in a fictional world. So we've
Yes.
mentioned before that sometimes it seems like there's too much setup or explanation in a query. In this one, the only thing that I felt like that about is that there's the name of the main character's village is in it, and I felt like we didn't
Yeah.
really need to know that, and it adds this level. I struggle with fantasy and science fiction names in queries. In a
Yes.
novel, they're fine for me, but in a query, I have kind of a hard time. I guess because they're not like real words. So the more not real words there are in there, the harder it is for me to kind of put those pieces together. This might just be a me thing. I don't know. This might
No,
totally
I
might
think
just be me.
I think that's a universal thing. Unless the name is really kind of showing the culture you're pulling from, it's really not necessary.
Right.
So, and usually you can get that from the main character names. We don't
Right.
need the town. We don't need the world. We don't need like specific places
Right.
or special names of things. We need the layman terms to
Right.
kind of
Well,
move it along.
And to be
get the
fair,
point.
I think in a query set in our world, we don't necessarily need to know where something is set either. Unless the
Exactly.
setting is like so tied to the story that it could not possibly be set anywhere else.
Right.
So, there are definitely stories like that. So when that's the case, you can use it. But otherwise, I'm not sure we really need to know the name of a city where a story takes place. The other thing I had a little bit of a struggle with is that last paragraph of the summary. So I think it's the fourth paragraph in the query. There's just like, we need to see a little bit more detail about what obstacles the main characters have to face. What do they have to overcome? And that'll really make your stakes pop more. So in this query, it sort of rushes to like, they get this new piece of information, and then they're going to have to, this is the stakes of what happens if they can't defeat the bad guy, basically. And it can be really helpful. It can make your stakes really pop if you give us, say, 2 or 3 examples of what big obstacles they're going to have to face, what are the main conflicts they're going to have to address in order to be able to resolve this plot. And that just really, it just makes those stakes really seem much stronger in that case.
Especially if they're more personal besides saving the world. That's usually my least favorite stake, because it's like, okay, the world's big. Yeah, we should save it. We're going to save it. But you really want to see those, what is connecting that character to those stakes, like those really intimate ones is what makes your query really pop, I think.
Yes, I agree.
I was really intrigued by this query. I definitely want to read the book. I always like upending the chosen one trope, because that's one of my least favorite tropes. So if you can flip it, I get very excited. I do think this query was a little stilted or formal some of the time. Like, there's the use of the word fortunately, so it's like, fortunately, X, blah, 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 blah. Instead of flowing right into what we need to know.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of those kind of filler formal words that aren't necessary in a query, because, yes, it's a formal business letter, but that kind of happens up top when we're getting into, like, your summary and, like, that little, more of the blurb section of your query. We don't need that formality. We need more emotion.
Yeah.
And it got very buzzy. There's a lot of, like, big buzzwords that it was trying to hit. That just felt inauthentic at times. But there were some really interesting, like, twinges of humor, especially when it was discussing the male lead and how the chosen one trope is kind of upended. There was some cool hints of humor with those introductions, which I really loved, and I wanted kind of more of. I wanted to lean in more into that, like, how this is different and how this is kind of funny maybe, or a little goofy if it is, or I think the tone was a little bit missing. I couldn't tell if it was funny or serious or both, and kind of how that plays together with your word choices.
Sure.
Just be really careful with your word choices. Get rid of that filler. Don't focus so much on buzzwords. Like, really nail that voice and tone a little bit more.
Right.
And I think if you do that, this query is pretty ready to go. It was very clean.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't have, like, it hit most of the points we needed to kind of hit. We just needed more of that oomph, I think.
Yeah. I think these points will take a good query to great.
Yes, exactly. It's a solid query, but it could be better. All right. So on our next podcast, we will be discussing the Black comedy Parasite. We will also have another query or blurb critique. If you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that below or on our Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.